Hello everyone and welcome to today's base clinic. I'm really pleased to have Steve back with us today, our resident expert on all the things recruitment, and he's going to be talking through some of the top tips for interview before a Q&A session. So please feel free to get ready with any questions that you have. There's a chat box on the right hand side, so please feel free to put those questions in throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end, and I'll pick them up as we go through, and Steve will be there to answer them when he has a chance in the presentation. So worth mentioning just before we get started that Steve also has a group on our website for any recruitment questions that you may have. So if something occurs to you later on, you can contact Steve directly through the Aviation Base, and he'll be able to answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, over to you, Steve.
Hello everybody, good evening. Hope we're all keeping okay. I'm speaking to you from a very damp and very cold Macclesfield at the moment, which has seen a bit of snow and a bit of rain and a bit of ice. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Joe. I mean, really all about what we're going to talk about today. Please interact as much as you want and as much as you can. It's your opportunity to ask questions. Not remotely bothered about being interrupted. You can interrupt me as much as you want. And Joe, if you want to interject, if you see some stuff while I'm talking that I don't spot, please just jump in, eh? So it is a recruitment clinic, but I thought it would be good to concentrate on some of the sort of top 10 areas that I used to see as an airline recruiter, things where people let themselves down maybe, or areas where people don't necessarily put in the right amount of focus that maybe would be good for them. So a little bit about me. Firstly, I'm very old, which is unfortunate, but I started off my career in the Air Force. But unusually, it was the American Air Force. So I used to fly that funny little thing on the top of the picture there. And then I moved back to the UK and flew for the Royal Air Force, flying the Nimrod. But in the meantime, I also managed to fly that little monster at the bottom of the picture, which is a B-24 Liberator, which was amusing. I left the Air Force. I joined the civilian world. That's my first aeroplane, the MD-83, for a company called Air Tours. That was based in Manchester and Newcastle for me. And then they became my travel, and I moved on to the 330 for my travel. I got a bit of wanderlust though later on in life, so I went to Tokyo and flew for ANA, and then Jetstar in Singapore, back to Thomas Cook, and then we all know what happened to Thomas Cook, and I ended up flying for these guys in Greece. And then COVID came around the corner, so it's been quite an experience over the years. But for most of those airlines, I've had some element of recruitment responsibility, and the main responsibility for recruitment for Thomas Cook. So that's my background, so you can understand where I've come from when I talk about recruitment. So like I said, we'll focus on some of the 10 top tips. So whatever you're going to do when it comes to trying to join a company, and I'm using the word join a company because what I'm going to talk about is equally applicable in most ways to any form of interview or assessment process, but obviously we're focusing on the pilot side. But you know, there are pilots possibly on this call even who are going to have to look at other careers on a temporary basis because of what's happening in the world. So this stuff is still relevant, whatever your aviation or non-aviation background actually is. And the first thing, if you remember this, is you only get invited to an interview if they have a job to give away. It's a pointless exercise for a company to waste time interviewing if they have no intention of hiring anybody. So have that confidence to know that if you get as far as an interview invite, they need you and they want you. It's a competitive process. So here's tip one. Because like everything, preparation starts way before the event. For those of you who are even at the beginning of your flying careers, you know, if you prepare for a flying lesson, you're going to do better than if you just turn up and hope for the best. So why wouldn't you do that for any form of recruitment? So your CV and cover letter are kind of your calling card, aren't they? So that's the first point, to make sure that if you want to get as far as an interview, make sure your CV and cover letter are really, really, really smart and up to standard. And behind that, there's also research needs to be done, because your CV specifically should be tailored for whatever company you are trying to approach. So you need to research that company and look at what are they actually putting out in their advert. What are they actually putting out in what they require for that particular job? And that should be reflected to some degree in your CV. And equally, any cover letter that's required needs to be even more tailored for the company in question. Very often as a recruiter, you would see people sending in completely generic CVs. And there's only 2 times you should ever have a generic CV. One is to have it on file, and then you use that to tailor and develop for a particular company. And 2 is for that odd occasion when you're out having a walk somewhere and somebody says, look, Fred Bloggs Airlines is recruiting, but it's closing in 10 minutes. Then you might have to gamble on sending off a generic CV, but otherwise it should never be generic. It should be tailored for the company or airline to which you're applying. The second part of being prepared is understand what documentation you're likely to need at any airline application stage, let alone interview. So it's not uncommon, especially outside of the UK, for companies to want to see education certificates, proof of degree, and maybe a little bit further down the line, you might need to have criminal record checks for any country that you've lived in. All of that takes time. And again, it's going to be a competitive market. So you can't really say, oh, it's going to take me 5 weeks to get that information together. It just won't cut it. So be ready and have all of that available. And in the background, do more research then outside of your cover letter and your CV on the particular company. Start to learn about who your target employer is. Start to think like them. Start to understand what they are all about, because that's really going to put you in a great position a little bit later on when you hopefully get as far as an assessment day. So that's tip 1. Preparation, really, really important. And sometimes it's very clear as a recruiter that people haven't done it. Just a little soundbite for you. I don't know if you realize, but in recruitment, quite often a recruiter will look at your CV for just a few seconds, literally 15, 20 seconds, to decide whether or not you're going to go through to some form of next stage. So what's on there has to be good, and it has to be done in the correct way, and it has to be tailored, like I said, to that company. If they want to know that you've got a particular qualification, then make sure it's visible and near the top, because people haven't got time to look through a 3-page CV trying to find out whether or not you've got an ATPL. So help them by making sure that is available. And if you've got any questions on CVs at the end, of course, please ask. So tip 2 is kind of a variation of preparation. Let's say everything's gone to plan and you're now being invited to some sort of assessment day. Plan that in advance. How long is it going to take you to get there? What route are you going to take? How are you going to get there? Are you going to drive? Are you going to use public transport? You know, a million and one things, but don't just wing it. Excuse the pun. Make sure that you prepared. Dress code. I know it's a thing, but it's really important. Remember, especially for an airline, but in lots of non-airline jobs as well, you are really an ambassador for that company. So don't leave it till the morning of the interview to think out, right, what am I going to wear? Because it's got to be good. It's got to be what you need to wear for that day. Personally, when I do interviews, I have a backup as well. I always have a spare shirt ironed, just in case I screw up on the day and pour coffee down myself while I'm having breakfast. So have backup plans for everything. You know, what am I going to do if the train gets cancelled? How much time do I need to give myself between train connections if I'm doing that? What happens if there's a problem on the motorway and I'm driving? Have I thought about how long it's going to take me to do an alternative route? And what about the weather? You know, I know it's daft, but if the day of your interview, it's a surprise to you that it started snowing, then it's already too late. So have backups for everything. Think like an aviation person. I would say one of the things that used to annoy me most when I was recruiting was the frequency at which people were late. I've never really understood this, but it's surprising how often it happens. And, just remember, 10 extra minutes in bed is going to make absolutely zero difference to your performance on the day. It will make no difference at all. But being 10 minutes late could basically harm your process. Don't forget, even if it's a really great interview team who are really sympathetic and they don't mind you being late, in the back of your mind, you will be thinking, I was late. And that is going to ruin your killer answers that you've prepared. You're doing okay so far? I'm hoping that's a yes. So company research, tip 3. Everybody does this, but I would be surprised if people on the call haven't done the top 2 things, Wikipedia and Google, because we all do it. But the problem is, at an interview stage, if you're all repeating exactly the same facts in exactly the same way from exactly the same website, how on earth can you expect to stand out? So Wikipedia and Google are good openers for you to get some information about the company, but there's so much more that you should be doing. You should be looking for newspaper articles, for backgrounds. You can look at financials as well, but it would be ridiculous to expect you to memorize everything in there. But try and have an idea about the company that's your idea based on your research, not you memorizing a paragraph from Wikipedia, if that makes sense. Because as a recruiter, it's quite tedious to think, this is the 4th person today that's verbatim read me the first paragraph about this company on Wikipedia. The other thing that you can do as well that a lot of people forget about is they'll do this a week before their interview and get it all nailed. But, I talked about having backups and planning. Why don't you the night before the interview quickly just Google the company just to see if anything significant has happened or been announced a few days before, so at least you're right up fresh with the very latest information about that company. Another place to look at is on the company's website, and you'll look on most companies' websites, hidden away somewhere, it'll say press releases. And that's a great place to get some information about the latest thing that company is doing. And so many people don't do it. So if you do it and have some cool information, it's going to make you stand out. I was saying to Joe before we started, I was going to try and do 10 top tips, all beginning with P, and I nearly got there. But one of them would be professionalism. It's an important role joining an airline, whatever rank you join, and that includes cabin crew. It's a very public-facing role and a very safety-oriented role. So you've got to come across at any interview as professional. If you can't do that, it's going to make you not look like the sort of person they want to hire. So it's back to how you look. So you've done your preparation a week before, you've got your Armani suit and your silk tie, which is great. But if on the day you can't be bothered to do up your tie or you've got scruffy shoes, it kind of does say something about you. And it's not a professional look that you're giving. I'm a really bad example at the moment. Lockdown feed. Even if you're doing a video interview, pretend it's for real. So if you're doing a Zoom interview, try and look the part. How you talk. What do I mean by that? Listen to yourself, record yourself speaking, and try and then talk in a way that's professional. So don't waffle, be focused, be concise, sound confident, sound enthusiastic. But how you talk does say a lot about you. So try and fix that before the actual face-to-face interview. And think about how you're going to cope. How do you cope with things? There's always going to be challenges in any assessment process. So show them that you're resilient. Show them that if things don't go quite to plan, it's not a big deal for you. You can fix it. You can get round it. You can move on. It's not going to faze you. So there's my tip about professionalism. Have all of those things locked away. I'm going to take a sip of water to see if there's any questions. You still there, Joe?
Yeah, I'm still
Just
here,
checking.
Steve. Yeah, no, very, very interesting, and a very good point about the professionalism one, because, you know, first impressions really do count, and you can almost, from my experience of recruiting as well, which is not as much as you've done, Steve, but I can almost tell within the first few minutes of an interview, you get a sense of somebody, sense of the tone, and it's a lot about how people look, how they present themselves, how they talk.
And I think that's very, very important to understand. And as I say, quite often in an interview, you'll see people doing quite well, then they'll stumble on one thing, and then suddenly it falls apart. Now, in many ways, that's not the end of the world. But remember, if it's in the airline context, that the whole subject of resilience is huge, because you have to deal with fastballs all the time. And if each time you get a fastball, you crumble, that's actually a bit worrying. So especially in the airline context, don't let one little mess up define your whole interview. Move on, and they'll be impressed that you hear it. If anybody's like me, been locked down now in 3 different countries, you watch something like Strictly Come Dancing, and somebody who's a superstar goes on and makes a mess of it, and they don't get a very good mark. But then somebody else goes on and they make a bit of a boo-boo, but they recover and carry on. And the first thing the judges say is, they always say, well done. We noticed you stumbled, but you picked yourself up and you carried on. And that impresses people. So it's not just aviation, it's in anything.
Yeah, one of the airline interviews that I went to, they actually used a technique in order to try and make you feel slightly uncomfortable, to see how you would cope. And it was very simply that they'd say, oh, who is the CEO of our company? Who is the COO? And they'd keep listing roles until you couldn't go any further, and you were out, because they want to see how you would react to actually not knowing the question and feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah.
There was an advert out last year for an airline based in Turkey. I won't name it specifically, but in their advert, they say, don't get stressed that we are going to stress you. It's nothing to worry about. It's just what we do in the interview. So you can expect challenging questions. It's fair, and it's the same for everybody. And, a challenging question is there for a reason. It's to just challenge you to see if you can kind of think on your feet a little bit. And Joe, you're right. Sometimes it almost gets ridiculous, where it's like, right, name what's the toilet cleaner. It keeps going down a list until you stop. But it's not something that should faze you.
Okay.
And that leads into positivity. If you walk into an interview situation and you look disinterested and not engaged, and you don't want to be there, and you don't sound positive, it's absolutely impossible for you to score as high as you should be scoring. So tip 5 for everybody is to be positive when you go to that. Be positive in your own abilities, and be positive in the attitude that you portray to the people in the room. It'll make a huge difference. I've actually done an interview on somebody, and afterwards, the way it tends to work in an interview, certainly in the airline context, but very much so across the board, I think, is you'll normally have at least 2 people conducting the interview these days, and that's for a fairness reason. So you finish doing your stuff, you leave the room, then the 2 people who've been conducting the interview will sit down and do a little negotiation about the marking. And it would be quite normal for one person to say, I thought they're brilliant, I'm going to give them 4 out of 5. And the other person might say, well, I wasn't so sure. I thought they were only about a 2. Then you have a little bit of a discussion, and it probably ends up at 3, which is, fair, and it's a discussion that's gone on. But quite often when you leave the room, the 2 people or the 3 people say, gosh, they didn't really seem to want to be here, did they? And the second that comes out of their lips, they now will not score you very highly, because they've all concluded you didn't seem interested. So be positive. This is kind of a bit of a return, but I wanted to talk about this more. So perfection. This is where people let themselves down in the interview phase at airlines and the simulator phase. Okay, very important. It's absolutely normal to make mistakes. I can't tell you how often I see people crumble. It's normal to make a mistake. I make mistakes. I've already made more mistake in this presentation already. It's normal. So don't worry about it. Recover from it. I'm going back to that word, resilient. Joe kind of led me into this as well. It's okay to not know an answer to a question, but think about how you're professionally and confidently going to declare that you don't know. If in an interview scenario, every time they ask you a question, you effectively say, pass, I don't know, pass, that's not good. But you can fend it off a little bit. You can say, that's a really good question. Now, just give me a few minutes, please, while I just formulate my answer. Just give yourself that breathing space. And always look forwards. In the interview, you should never at any point allow your brain to go backwards. Think, oh God, on that last question, but one, I didn't answer that very well. Don't do that, because you haven't got time and it'll befuddle you. And then the next question you get asked, you'll really mess up. So keep looking forwards throughout the whole interview. Keep looking forwards and not backwards at what may or may not have happened. Always remember that they are professionals themselves. So there's very little that you can do in an interview that they haven't seen before. But what they can recognize is somebody who's got talent, and that's for you to show. When it comes to the simulator stage for pilots, this is something that is really important. And the most depressing thing to hear in a simulator is afterwards when the pilot says, well, I wouldn't have done that in real life. And that is such a sad thing to say, because how can you say that in real life you wouldn't have done it? You've just demonstrated to me in the simulator that's what you've done. So it's a very bad thing to say. In the simulator, you're nervous. I personally find it much more nerve-wracking than an interview. So you're nervous. So you are going to make some small mistakes. It is normal. But to use the analogy of I wouldn't do that in real life, if in real life you would do a go-around when you mess something up, why in the simulator when you're being looked at would you not do a go-around? Why would you try and carry on making an approach that clearly is not going to work? So don't pressure yourself to not fail. Does that make sense? What do I mean by that? Don't pressure yourself so much that you know you're doing something that isn't going to work, but you don't want to be appearing to fail. Because when you crunch into the ground in the simulator, then it's too late. So if you do something that's not right, man up, do your go around, sort it out, verbalize to the guy, look, I wasn't stable on that approach. I'm not happy. So we've got plenty of fuel. I did a go around. We'll go back round. I'll give myself a few more seconds and it should be fine this time. And then if you do a great approach in landing off the second one, the people are going to be really impressed and really happy because you've demonstrated to them some really important safety markers. You didn't try and press on. You didn't try and rescue something that couldn't be rescued. Okay, so don't worry. Quite often what happens is you'll turn onto the runway and you'll suddenly realize you've not even put your lights on or something like that. It's a small mistake. It will not be the difference between pass and fail. But if you think about just for the whole simulator detail in more and more areas, so don't let that happen to you. Tip 7 is know what to expect from the particular company that you're going to go and do the interview for. So Joe mentioned that some companies can be quite difficult in actual fact. Right now in Europe, Wizz Air is doing some recruitment, and their process is quite intense, really, for what's needed. But it's their airline, so it's their choice. And what you can see in front of you on this slide is all of the elements that you can expect at some point during an airline assessment. The way it's color coded is there for a reason, because some airlines, typically the bigger ones, but I've already mentioned Wizz, but Emirates and people like that, it's a rolling process. You've got to get through the light blue group to be allowed to do the purple group, and you've got to get through the purple group to be allowed to do the simulator group. Smaller airlines or other airlines might put it all together in one fairly intense long day, but the process remains the same. And not everybody follows the same pathway as well. Not everybody says, let's do the simulator at the end. So for example, Aegean Airlines, they don't have their own simulator. They're a big airline, but they don't have their own simulator. So they have to book the simulators in advance. They're not going to get any money back. They're there anyway. So they do the simulator first. It's the first thing that you do, not the last thing that you do. So be ready and do that research. Practice. Still got another P in there. So practice is really important. You know, if you're going to do a best man speech, you tend to do a bit of a practice, don't you? If you're going to do a presentation, you at least have a run through first to see how it's going to work. So the same applies to an assessment. So think about core questions, because you know whatever company, whether it's Tesco's or Air Transylvania, they are probably going to have some core questions. Tell us a bit about it yourself. You know, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? All that sort of stuff. They're core questions. So you should be able to just rattle off answers for those really easily and convincingly. But also knowing a bit more about the style of questions a particular company asks, that's really important too. But concentrate on the style, not on the exact question. Because if you convince yourself that they're going to ask you, you know, a particular exact question, and then they don't ask it, it's going to confuse your mind a bit. So just look at the style of questions, not actual questions too much. You can practice for airline assessment aptitude tests. I categorically would not be able to pass aptitude testing for an airline tomorrow if I hadn't practiced, because it's a technique. And even as basic as sitting down, you know, how are you going to, when you get into an interview room, actually sit down? Are you going to be working out what to do with your hands? Work out what works for you in front of a desk. Sit down and think, okay, yeah, I can do this. This is a comfortable, non-stressful position for me. It stops my knees wobbling. It stops my hands twitching. So, you know, it's a small thing, but every little thing that you can do helps. Now, I mentioned aptitude tests. So there's some real examples. And the abstract reasoning one is very common. You probably get a whole session on these if it's an airline that does this sort of psychometric testing. And it's all about learning how they work. And once you know that, you can rattle these off in seconds. If anybody after we've finished wants to talk and work out what the answers are, I can tell you what the answers are. But it's all about identifying patterns. And there's loads of books out there. There's lots of online resources out there. Don't go out buying things straight away. Go and have a bit of free practice on the internet to get an idea about it. And then once you've got into the zone, it suddenly becomes easy. It's like having two people in the room who do crosswords. Person who does a Telegraph crossword and somebody who does a Daily Mail crossword. I would not be able to do the Telegraph crossword, and the Telegraph person probably wouldn't be able to do the Daily Mail crossword, because they've practiced the particular ways that the crossword setter asks questions for those particular newspapers. And it's the same for this. There's a lot of numerical and reasoning questions, English comprehension questions, and they're all focusing on pilot competencies. You know, in the numerical question there, the answer should take you 2 seconds in principle. But what they're trying to do is to see, do you become bogged down with detail? Are you going to become bogged down with irrelevant data? Are you becoming unable to make a decision because there are so many bits of information in front of you? So it is really geared towards a pilot's brain. So tip 9, pitfalls. These are the things that people did wrong the most often. And it's a little bit of a summary about what we've talked about. So being late was incredibly common, so don't do it. Being unconvincing, that can be in many formats. It can be poor research. It can be unusual answers or answers that don't actually answer the question. And that is very common when it comes to competency-based questioning. So competency-based questioning tends to be things like, tell me about a time that you have used your leadership skills to solve a difficult situation or to resolve a difficult situation. So what people tend to do is to think about this, and they have a really good competency-based leadership question answer in their mind. The problem is they're so desperate to use this amazing answer that they don't actually listen to the question. So you end up giving a leadership answer to something that's a customer service question. So it's not a convincing answer because it doesn't tick the boxes that were asked at the beginning of the question. Being enthusiastic is really important. It gives the interviewer the impression that you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about, and as I said before, that you want to be there. So throughout your answers, try and be engaged and enthusiastic and use body language. You know, you should be trying to make eye contact with people. It's more difficult on Zoom, but even then, you should still regard it as a real interview, and try and engage with the people. Don't, if there's 2 or 3 people, focus just on one person the whole time, missing out a valid partner in that interview. Be enthusiastic and don't be evasive. You know, I mentioned before about work out how you're going to say, I can't answer that question. Don't skirt around things if they're not things that should be skirted around. You know, there will be times when you'll be asked really challenging questions. And if you're asked one, you will have to address it. Just trying to skirt around it will only mean they'll probe even more until they get either I don't know or they get an answer. So try not to be evasive. And tied in with evasive, you could put underneath that honesty. Honesty is critical in the interview scenario, because if you're coming across as evasive or dishonest or covering up facts, that's a terrible marker in the airline world, because it means you're the sort of person who's not going to report safety events. So don't do it. Really watch that one. And then the final one that ties it all together is this. Just remember that the interview team are human beings just like you. Yes, there might be some, you know, online video assessments previous to the full interview. But when you do an interview face-to-face, be it Zoom or be it in when we're allowed to, in an office environment, in a room environment, the people on the other side of the table are humans just like you. And because they're humans, you can subtly kind of influence how they feel about you by using soft skills, by being a good person in that room. Understanding the basics of interview technique can make a huge, huge difference. So don't underestimate that. Remember that they're human. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that in things like competency-based questions, you should follow the STAR, situation, task, action, and result process, because it concentrates everything into a relatively short space of time so that humans on the other side of the table can understand what you're talking about, but also keep it within a reasonable time frame. So, you know, they've got pressures as well. Interview teams tend to work really, really hard. It's an incredibly long day for them. So when somebody waffles and never gets to the actual answer, it's quite stressful for them, because they're working out how we're going to get back on track. Typically in the airline environment, by the way, when you do the face-to-face interview, it's typically for the interview team done on a 1 hour roster. So they will have somebody in at 10 o'clock, let's say. You will be interviewed till, let's say, 10:45 and then disappear. That gives them 5 minutes to do their write-up on you, 5 minutes to quickly grab a coffee or nip to the loo, and 5 minutes to quickly review the CV of the next candidate. So that's why they like people to stay on track. Nearly finished. Just to bear in mind, Aspect Aviation, who I'm talking on behalf of today, we have some great stuff out there, and it's all available on Base. You can have a look, but we have mentors available. We do CV reviews, CV writing, and what I'm talking about today, we do interview coaching as well. And that kind of leads us to now questions. If anybody's got any questions, anything they'd like to ask, anything they'd like to discuss. But before we do that, it's my secret tip 11. because the one thing I can almost guarantee you're going to get in your interview is at the end of it, they're going to say to you, have you got any questions? And that's normally where you go, and you were doing really well to that point. So it's one of those questions you should be prepared for. Have you got any questions? You might not, but think of something slightly more impressive than no. There's lots of techniques you can use. So even if you haven't got any questions about what you've just been through, or the company or the interview team, you could do something that's a bit more convincing. You could, for example, say, actually, I thought I was going to have loads of questions, but throughout the whole process today, they've all been answered. So really, I just want to say thank you very much indeed for letting me put across myself to you. And I hope I've answered all of your questions for you. It's more convincing than a no. So always try and finish on that positive high. And of course, if you've got a question, ask it, but try to make it a sensible question. Think about markers and what they're looking for. If the only question you've got is, what's the starting salary? That's two negatives. One, you could have found out, you could have done some research. And two, you're only here to find out how much money I can get out of me. So it's not a great question. That's something you can do outside of the room. But you might want to ask people like, okay, I'd just be very interested, which bases are you currently recruiting for? Or could you just confirm, is it just the Boeing fleet that you're recruiting for? Or are you actually recruiting for the Airbus fleet as well? Be engaged and interested for sure, but don't focus it all about money or how many days off leave do I get a year? No, that's kind of a negative. So it's over to you and Joe.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. There's lots in that presentation, lots of brilliant information. We've got a few questions. I'll just start with one here. I believe some companies use a psychologist to identify weak areas, then try to trip the interviewee up.
Okay, that's a really, really good question. I don't know who asked that. When I'm talking, I tend not to look at the chat side because I get distracted and wander off into my own little world. So the psychological testing is actually a requirement now. It was after the Germanwings crash. It was a strong recommendation under EASA and IATA, but it's now a requirement. It's not optional. So you have to have psychological testing now as part of an airline interview process. It tends to be done initially with you sat in front of a computer asking and answering 1,000,001 questions. They'll just go on and on about questions like, you're at a party, do you prefer to stand at the corner of the room or in the middle of the room? And that question will keep coming up over and over and over again. It's then analysed partially by a machine reader, and then now it is a requirement that it's analysed by a human being who is a trained psychologist as well. In some companies, that trained psychologist will be in your interview. And it may be that some of the responses that you've given, they will use that as the opportunity to speak to you and ask directed questions based on some of the answers you've given. It's not something to be overly stressed about, because I've got to be fairly blunt on this, and don't quote me, but to get as far as the interview, when you think about the psychological testing, you are so way out there in that direction or so way out there in that direction, probably you wouldn't have got as far as the interview in the first place. What they're just doing is focusing on one or two little areas, and quite common actually is for people who are starting their career, because some of the answers you give in the psychological testing might give some indication of areas that you may need support doing your flying training, for example. So it's not something to really, really worry about. Just be open and honest and let them do their thing, and don't be surprised about it, because it is a requirement that there has to be some sort of formal interface between the psychologist and you. How that's done is up to them. It could literally be a phone call, or it could be that they're there, or they could get everybody in the room together and just say, look, we've all been together, blah, blah, blah. But the psychologist's presence is not unusual.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Steve. There's a question here. I managed to get through all the stages of the Aer Lingus pilot program in 2019, all the way up to the interview stage. It was a challenging interview, but felt I did all the above and answered the questions really well. There were things I felt I could have done better, but nothing bad. Unfortunately, I wasn't successful, and I assume it was my performance in the interview, as this was the last stage, but I've had no feedback, so not sure how to improve for next time.
Yeah, I can see that. That's from Jordan, isn't it? Jordan, I'm really sorry that you didn't get feedback, and I personally regard that as a failing by any company. I do not see why any company should be terrified of giving some basic feedback. Certainly, a little bit of guidance is not going to be something that you could hold the company to at a later stage. Fair enough, I understand when people don't want to go into too much detail, but I certainly always try to give people some vague idea in a general area of what they might need to prepare a bit better for next time. So I'm sorry about that. I suppose it falls back into self-analysis and practice. So I don't know exactly what the Aer Lingus process is in the interview, whether they do the interview with the technical interwebbed or whether they do them as two separate interviews. Maybe I would just look at perhaps thinking about the soft skills. Was it that I answered questions okay, but I was answering them fidgeting, or I was answering them and muttering, or I was answering them but not really getting to the point, even though I think I've answered them? You know, there are areas that you could maybe self-analyze, which would definitely help you for next time. But obviously, without knowing what they asked you in the interview, I can't really say much more than that. But improvement for next time is always about practice, research, and improving yourself in the interview scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. What advice would you give for an interview with the Gulf Airlines or Far Eastern Airline?
Well, for any Far Eastern airline, expect the unexpected. The last one that I did when I went into the interview room, there were 8 people, which was something of a shock, because they all like to get involved. But don't let that phase you, because it actually often makes the interview a bit easier, because the question quality tends to go down with so many people interfering and being involved. So don't worry about it. Certainly, both Singapore and Japan, it's more of a committee interview quite often than a one-to-one or two-to-one interview. They can focus on what might appear to be trivia, and I can't tell you what it's going to be, but they can be very, typically in Asia, they like you to memorize things. That's quite a common thing. So they'll ask you, what is the hydraulic pressure on the aircraft type that you're going for? And it's not, oh, round about 3,000, it's 3,157. You know, that's the sort of focus they can get a bit on. But it goes back to, if you are going to get the opportunity to go to an assessment in Asia, do that research, speak to people, find out who's done it before. If it's through an agency, if it's anything like a good agency, they should be able to give you loads of hints and clues as to the sort of thing to expect. So, you know, again, being prepared is always part of that process.
That's brilliant. Do you have any experience of any Gulf airline interviews? Anything about that?
The Gulf ones tend to be the ones that follow that color-coded process that I showed you. So you turn up as a huge gaggle on day one, and by that evening, the gaggle is shrunk because some people are on the evening flights home. And then the next day you go through the next phase, and then it's a relatively small number of people who get as far as the simulator. So it's not brutal. It's just because they have the money and the facility and big recruitment teams, they can do it in Emirates. You will turn up at the Premier Inn at Dubai, which, by the way, is owned by Emirates, which there's a hint as to the sort of people who might be around in that hotel. And then the next day, you've got your smartest kit on, and you go off and you do your day ones, which is all the psychometrics and that sort of stuff. And it's very visible. I used to do a little bit of stuff for Jetstar with Emirates, so I used to stay in their Premier Inn, and you would see that the group is significantly smaller by the following breakfast. So it's fairly brutal, but there's no point you staying if you haven't matched a standard that they insist on at the very beginning. So if they have a particular pass mark in their psychometric testing, your aptitude testing, then if you haven't made that pass mark, there's no real point going on. Some small airlines tend to have it a little bit more holistic, so they'll have an overall total package pass mark, and you could potentially get, let's say the overall pass mark is 70, you could get, say, 65 in the aptitude testing and 75 in the interview, and that brings it up to that magic 70, for example. But you can do your research and find out.
Yeah, okay. So sort of reaching out to people that potentially have gone through the selection process.
Yeah, I mean,
I know exactly what
Emirates, Qatar, and maybe less so Etihad, but Emirates and Qatar, there's a huge wealth of resource out there from people who've been, I've got to be careful what I say, because I don't want to say that people are actually selling questions, but there's a lot of resource out there that you can access and you should access, and it's an investment. It's hard work, but it's an investment in your future, so it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, so we'll just wait and see if there's any few last questions.
I just see one there, another one from Jordan, but I think I've answered indirectly in a different question. But yeah, the technical doesn't have to be at the same time as the interview, and it depends which airline you're going to. So some airlines have a ridiculous focus on technical questions that goes on and on and on. If you are a new graduate from flying training, you can expect their technicals to be maybe longer, but they're going to be looking more at ATPL type questioning, because it's not reasonable for you to know about the Airbus if you've never flown it. You should know something about it, but they can't really go into depth on the Airbus, as an example. And then if you're already qualified on the type, I personally don't see the point into going into too much depth. You've got an ATPL, you've passed 6 years of LPCs and OPCs. There's got to be some acceptance that you're qualified at some point. So quite often then your technical will be mixed in as part of your interview. So the interview will go through phases. It'll be, tell me about yourself, tell me why you want to join us, tell us what you know about us. Here's 3 or 4 competency-based questions. Now let's move on to some other questioning, some emotional intelligence questioning and some technical questions.
That's perfect. Great. So I don't think we've got any last questions. So just want to say a big thank you. That was really helpful, Steve. Got a lot out of that. I'm
no
sure.
Problem at all.
As well. So we'll be back for another clinic, I hope, very soon with some more recruitment gen. But in the meantime, if you do have any questions, Steve does have that group on the Aviation Base. So please feel free to reach out directly to Steve, connect with him, send him a message or post on that group for other people to see the responses to. And yeah, we'll see you back again very soon.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, do go to that resource. I'll always try and answer questions. And Jo's a tough cookie. She's negotiated some very good discounts as well with me, so take advantage of them. She's got you some good deals.
Brilliant.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care. Have a nice evening. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye.
Bye now.